At 75, she was locked out of her own home. What she found beneath the city changed everything. The hallway still smelled the same. Bleach, old carpet, something cooked hours ago. Marjorie stood there, watching a stranger replace the lock on her door while her son spoke like this had already been decided. No shouting, no argument, just quiet finality. Minutes later, she stepped outside with one suitcase and nowhere left to go. If you were in her place that morning, what would you have done first? The hallway smelled the same as it always had. Boiled cabbage from somewhere down the corridor, a sharp trace of bleach, old carpet holding years of footsteps. It was a smell Marjorie Hale could have recognized with her eyes closed. She stood just outside her apartment door, her gloved hands resting lightly on the handle of a small, worn suitcase, the kind with wheels that clicked faintly when they rolled over uneven floors. Beside her, a canvas grocery bag leaned against the wall. Inside it, folded clothes, a few photographs, nothing that took up much space. At her feet, Pip shifted inside his carrier, nails scratching softly against the plastic. He made a small sound, uncertain, questioning. Marjorie didn't look down at him. She was watching the man kneeling in front of her door. The locksmith worked quietly, efficient, focused. His tools lay spread out on a folded cloth, arranged in neat rows like instruments in a surgical room. Metal clicked against metal as he adjusted the new deadbolt, tightening it into place with steady, practiced movements. He didn't look at her either. Nobody did. Behind him, Daniel stood with his hands in the pockets of his coat. His shoulders were slightly hunched, though the hallway wasn't cold. He had always stood that way when he didn't want to be in a conversation. Marjorie noticed that. She noticed everything now. His hair had gone thinner since the last time she really looked at him. Not just glanced, but looked. The lines around his mouth were deeper. He kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as if he were waiting for something to be over. Behind Daniel, a few steps back, stood Elise. Elise didn't pretend to be uncomfortable. She leaned lightly against the wall, arms crossed, her coat still buttoned. Her eyes moved occasionally, down the hallway, toward the stairs, anywhere but Marjorie. There was no hostility in her expression. Just absence. Like this had already been decided somewhere else long before this morning. The sound of the drill cut briefly through the quiet. Marjorie blinked once. "That should do it," the locksmith said under his breath, mostly to himself. He gave the handle a firm test. The new lock held solid. A different sound now. A sharper click. Not the one she had heard for 20 years. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mum," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. It's the best arrangement right now." The words came out flat, practiced, like something he had already said out loud before this moment, somewhere else to someone else. Marjorie didn't answer. She looked at the door. Her door. The paint along the edge had a small chip near the bottom corner. She remembered when that happened. Pip had been younger then, full of energy, scratching at the wood when he heard footsteps in the hallway. She had meant to fix it. Never got around to it. The brass number, 3B, was slightly crooked. It had always been that way. She used to think about straightening it. Never did. Small things. Things that only mattered if you believed you would always be there to notice them. "I spoke with the manager," Daniel continued. "They've already updated the lease. It's all handled." Handled. Marjorie finally turned her head. She looked at him fully now. Not the boy she had raised, not the teenager who used to leave dishes in the sink, not the man who called her once a week, out of habit more than anything else. Just Daniel. Standing in the hallway, talking about her life like it was paperwork. "You'll be more comfortable somewhere smaller," he added quickly. "Less to worry about. It just makes sense." Elise shifted slightly, uncrossing her arms, then crossing them again, still not looking at Marjorie. The locksmith stood up, brushing his hands together. He picked up his tools, folding them back into the cloth with quiet precision. Daniel handed him cash. They spoke in low voices. A transaction simple. Finished. Marjorie glanced down at her suitcase. She had packed it herself the night before. Slowly, carefully, folding things the way she always had. There were more things she could have taken, but she hadn't. Because somewhere along the line she had understood, without anyone saying it, that taking more would only make this harder. For them, not for her. The locksmith gave a polite nod in her direction before heading down the hallway. His footsteps faded quickly. Daniel stepped forward and took the new keys from his pocket. He turned them once in the lock. Another click. Firm. Final. "You've got everything?" he asked, finally looking at her, but only briefly. Marjorie followed his gaze to the suitcase, the bag, the carrier. Everything. "Yes," she said. Her voice sounded steady. That surprised her. Pip let out a small whine. She reached down, resting her fingers lightly against the carrier. He quieted almost immediately. Daniel nodded, relieved at the lack of resistance. "Okay," he said. "Good." No hug. No hesitation. Elise moved toward the door, stepping past Marjorie without brushing against her. She opened it easily, as if she had already done it 100 times. The space beyond looked the same. Same narrow entryway, same pale walls, same light filtering in from the living room window. But it didn't feel the same. Marjorie stood there for a moment longer, not waiting, just seeing. Then she picked up the handle of her suitcase. The wheels clicked softly as she turned. She didn't say goodbye. There didn't seem to be a place for it. As she walked down the hallway, she felt their presence behind her for a second. Then the door closed. Another click. Different from the first, but just as final. By the time she reached the stairwell, the smell of cabbage had faded, replaced by the colder scent of concrete and outside air slipping in through the cracks. She pushed the door open with her shoulder. The city met her without pause, wind cutting between buildings, the low rumble of traffic, a bus braking somewhere at the corner, people moving with purpose, heads down, coats pulled tight. Nobody looked at her. Marjorie stepped onto the sidewalk. She adjusted her grip on the suitcase, lifted the carrier slightly so Pip wouldn't bump against her leg. For a moment, she stood still. Then she started walking south. Not because she had decided on a direction, just because it was the way her body moved when there was nowhere left to stay. She did not look back. The wind followed her down the block. It slipped through the seams of her coat, sharp and familiar, the kind that carried the smell of the lake even this far inland. Traffic moved steadily. A bus hissed at the curb. Someone laughed too loudly across the street, the sound rising and falling without ever touching her. Marjorie kept walking. She didn't know where she was going. Not yet. But stopping felt worse. Pip shifted in the carrier again. This time she looked down. "It's all right," she said quietly. Her voice disappeared into the noise before it could settle anywhere. The motel sat 2 blocks from the elevated tracks. She saw it before she read the sign. Low building, peeling paint, a flickering neon vacancy that buzzed faintly even in daylight. The windows were narrow, curtains drawn tight. A man stood outside smoking, his jacket too thin for the weather. Marjorie paused at the entrance. This was not a place she had ever imagined stepping into. But then again, there were a lot of things she hadn't imagined this morning. Inside, the air was warmer, but only slightly. It carried a different smell, cleaning solution layered over something older, something that never quite went away. A woman behind the counter looked up. "You need a room?" she asked. Marjorie nodded. The woman slid a clipboard across without asking questions. The pen was tied to it with a short piece of string. Marjorie filled in her name carefully. The letters came out steady. That surprised her again. "How long?" the woman asked. Marjorie hesitated. "Just tonight," she said. The woman gave a small nod, already turning toward the key rack. $1.80, cash or card. Marjorie reached into her purse. Her fingers moved slowly, not because she didn't know where things were, but because she was aware, suddenly, of every dollar. She paid. The key was heavier than she expected. "Second floor," the woman said. "End of the hall." The room was narrow. Not small, narrow, like it had been stretched too far in one direction. The carpet was a dull gray, worn flat near the bed. The curtains were closed, letting in only a thin strip of light along one edge. Marjorie set the suitcase down first. Then the carrier. Pip stepped out carefully, sniffing the floor, then the corner of the bed. His movements were slower than they used to be, more deliberate. Marjorie watched him for a moment. Then she sat. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight. Springs gave a soft, tired sound. She placed her hands on her knees and stayed there. The first train came just after dusk. The sound built slowly, a distant rumble at first, then stronger, closer. The walls began to hum, faintly at first, then enough to feel through the mattress. The window rattled in its frame. Pip lifted his head. Marjorie didn't move. The train passed overhead, metal grinding against metal, a long exhale of noise that filled the room and then faded just as quickly. Silence returned, but not completely. There was always something underneath it now. She unpacked very little. One change of clothes, her toothbrush. The photographs stayed in the bag. She didn't take them out. There wasn't anywhere to put them. Instead, she reached for her purse again. A small notebook, a pen. She opened it on the bedside table. The numbers came easily. Savings, what she had left, what she could spend. She wrote down the cost of the room. $1.80. Then she multiplied. 7 days. 30. The pen paused. She adjusted the numbers, crossed out one line, wrote another. Her handwriting stayed neat. It always had. When she finished, she leaned back slightly, looking at the page. It didn't work. Not here. Not like this. She had known that already, but seeing it written down made it solid. Something she couldn't shift by thinking differently. Pip moved closer, resting his head lightly against her ankle. Marjorie reached down without looking, letting her hand settle on his back. His fur was warm. He exhaled slowly. The phone sat on the table beside the bed. She picked it up once, scrolled through her contacts. Names she recognized, some she didn't. Numbers she hadn't used in years. She stopped on one, then another. Her thumb hovered. No message notifications, no missed calls. She set the phone back down. Face down this time. The second night felt longer. The trains didn't come any more often. The room didn't change, but something inside the hours stretched. Marjorie found herself listening. To the pipes in the wall, the faint footsteps from the room above, a television playing somewhere down the hall, voices rising and falling without words she could make out. Time moved differently here. Slower in some ways, sharper in others. She made the calculations again that night. Same numbers, same result. Less money now. She adjusted one line, then another. Still didn't work. On the third morning, she stood at the window. She pulled the curtain back just enough to look out. The tracks ran parallel to the street, steel beams cutting across the sky. A train passed, slower this time, brakes screeching lightly as it approached the station further down. People waited on the platform. Coats pulled tight, hands in pockets, faces turned toward the arriving train. They shifted forward as the doors opened, moved inside, each one going somewhere. Marjorie watched until the platform was empty again. Then she let the curtain fall back into place. She sat on the edge of the bed. Same position as before, hands resting on her knees. But something had changed. Not outside, not in the room. Inside. It wasn't panic. That would have been easier to understand. It was quieter than that. A kind of absence. Like a space where something used to be. She thought about the hallway, the smell, the door. Daniel's voice. Not what he said, how he said it. Flat, certain, already finished. She thought about the phone, the names, the silence. No one had asked where she was. Not really. Not beyond that first moment. Marjorie looked down at her hands. They rested there, still steady, still capable. She turned one palm over slowly, studying the lines as if they might tell her something she hadn't already understood. Nothing new. Just what had always been there. Only now, there was no one else around to look at them. No one to notice. No one to ask. The room stayed quiet. The trains kept moving. And somewhere between one passing and the next, Marjorie realized she hadn't just left her apartment. She had stepped out of something else entirely, something that didn't seem to be looking for her anymore. She sat there a little longer. Then she reached for her coat. The fabric was still cold from the chair where she had left it the night before. She slipped it on slowly, buttoning it without looking down. The motions came from habit, not thought. Pip lifted his head as she stood. "You're staying," she said gently. He watched her, ears slightly raised, then lowered his head again onto the blanket she had folded for him at the foot of the bed. Marjorie picked up her purse, left the suitcase where it was. The hallway outside the room smelled stronger this morning. Something fried, something burnt. The carpet muffled her steps as she walked toward the stairs. Outside, the cold had settled deeper. The sky was a pale gray, stretched thin between buildings, the kind of morning that didn't seem to fully wake up. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking. The station entrance was only a few blocks away. She hadn't planned it the day before, or the day before that, but her feet had taken her there anyway, drawn by something simple. Warmth. Inside, the air changed immediately, still cool but contained. The sounds softened. Footsteps echoed differently here, contained within tile and concrete instead of disappearing into open air. People moved with purpose. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at her. Marjorie stepped to the side of the entrance, letting a group pass before moving toward the turnstiles. She hesitated for a moment, then reached into her purse. A transit card. She had kept it out of habit. The gate clicked open. She passed through. The platform was crowded, but not uncomfortably so. People spaced themselves out in quiet patterns. Some sat on benches. Others stood near the edge, watching the dark tunnel. A train arrived with a rush of wind. Doors opened. People shifted forward. Marjorie stepped inside with them. She didn't choose a seat. Instead, she stood near the door, one hand resting lightly against the metal pole. Pip's carrier sat at her feet. The train pulled away with a low, steady hum. She watched. Not the advertisements. Not the people. The movement. Stations passing. Doors opening, closing. The rhythm of it. There was something steady about it. Predictable. Unlike the last few days, where everything had shifted without warning. Here, things followed a pattern. She stayed on through 3 stops, 5, 8. People got on, got off, the car emptied, filled again, emptied once more. She didn't move. By midday, she had ridden the line twice end to end, not by accident. She was paying attention now. To the timing between stops. To the way the train slowed before each station. To the small differences, lighting, sound, even the way the air felt as the doors opened. On the 3rd loop, she noticed it. At first, it was nothing, just a darker stretch between 2 stations. But then a flicker. Not from inside the train, beyond it. She leaned slightly toward the window. The train slowed just enough. And there it was. A platform, but not like the others. No people, no movement. The lights were dim, some of them flickering weakly. A section of the wall was covered by what looked like a metal barrier, rust creeping along its edges. The train didn't stop. It passed through as if the place didn't exist. Marjorie straightened slowly. Her eyes stayed on the window until the platform disappeared into darkness behind them. No announcement had been made. No name had been called. Just passed. She stayed on the train for 2 more stops. Then she got off waited, boarded again. Same line, same direction. She positioned herself differently this time, closer to the opposite door, a clearer angle toward the window. She watched carefully as the train approached the same stretch, the same slowing, the same flicker. And there it was again. The platform, empty, forgotten. The metal barrier was clearer now, not blocking the entire space, just part of it. Behind it, a stairway angled upward into shadow. A sign hung crooked above it, the letters too faded to read at this speed. The train moved on. Marjorie didn't blink. That afternoon, she rode the line 4 more times. Each pass, she noticed something new. The way the lights didn't all flicker together, only certain sections. The pattern of tiles along the wall, older, different from the brighter ones in active stations. A bench near the far end, half visible. Dust gathered thick across it. No advertisements, no maps, nothing that suggested recent use. It didn't belong to the rest of the system anymore. And yet, it was still there. By evening, the train car had thinned out. Fewer passengers. Quieter. Marjorie sat this time, Pip's carrier resting lightly against her leg. She closed her eyes briefly as the train moved, feeling the rhythm of it beneath her. Then she opened them again just before the platform. She didn't want to miss it. Not even a second. The train slowed. The darkness shifted. And there it was. Still the same, still waiting, still unnoticed. Or maybe, not noticed enough to matter. When she returned to the motel that night, the room felt smaller. Not physically, but in a way she couldn't quite name. She set the carrier down, took off her coat, sat on the edge of the bed. Same position, same view. But her mind wasn't in the room anymore. It was back on the train, counting stops, measuring time, replaying the image of that platform over and over, the barrier, the stairway, the flickering lights. Something about it stayed with her. Not because it was useful, not yet, but because it didn't fit. And things that didn't fit, they had a way of meaning something. The next morning, she left earlier. Earlier than the trains felt busy. Earlier than most people seemed fully awake. She stood on the platform, watching, counting. 1 train, 2, 3. She let them pass. Not boarding, just observing. Timing the intervals. Listening for patterns in the announcements, in the way the trains approached. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was learning. By the time she stepped onto the train again, her movements were quieter, more deliberate. She stood in the same place as before, watched the same window, waited for the same moment. The train slowed. The lights flickered, and the platform appeared again, just as it had every time before. Unchanged, unclaimed, unnoticed. Marjorie leaned slightly closer this time, not enough to draw attention, just enough to see a little more. The barrier, the stairs, the darkness beyond. Her reflection faintly layered over it in the glass. She studied both. Then the train moved on. When she stepped off later, she didn't go back to the motel right away. Instead, she stood near the exit of the station, watching the flow of people. Thinking, not about where she would sleep, not about the numbers in her notebook, but about that place between stations. The one no one mentioned, the one no one used, the one the train passed without stopping. She adjusted her grip on Pip's carrier, then turned back toward the platform. Not because she had a plan, not yet, but because she knew she wasn't done looking. The next evening, she returned later than before. The city had shifted into that quieter hour, not silent, but slower. Fewer voices, fewer footsteps. The kind of time when people had already decided where they were going to be for the night. Marjorie moved through the station entrance without hesitation. Down the stairs, past the turnstiles, onto the platform. She stood in the same place she had chosen earlier that morning. Not too close to the edge, not too far back. A place where she could watch without being noticed. The train arrived. She stepped inside. She didn't sit this time. She stood near the door again, one hand resting lightly against the pole, Pip's carrier positioned carefully at her feet. Her eyes stayed on the window. Waiting. The train moved. Stations passed. The rhythm settled in. She counted without thinking. 1 stop, 2, 3. Her body adjusted to the motion, but her focus didn't shift. Then, the lights outside flickered. The train slowed just enough, and the platform appeared, same as before. Dim, empty, forgotten. But tonight, she noticed something she hadn't before. A break in the barrier. Not large, just enough. section where the metal had bent slightly inward, leaving a narrow gap between the frame and the wall. Not something a person would see unless they were looking for it. Marjorie leaned slightly closer. The train continued past. The platform slipped into darkness again. But the image stayed with her clear, precise, a gap. She got off at the next stop. Waited. Boarded another train heading back in the opposite direction. Positioned herself differently this time, closer to the door that would line up with that side of the platform. The train moved. Her breathing slowed. Not from fear, from focus. She didn't look around, didn't watch the other passengers, only the window, only the moment. The train slowed again. The lights flickered. And there it was, the gap. Clearer now. A space just wide enough for a person to pass through if they turned slightly. Behind it, the stairs. Leading upward into shadow. No light above, no movement, just darkness waiting. The train moved on. Marjorie didn't move. She stayed on for 2 more stops, then got off again. This time she didn't board right away. She stood on the platform, watching the trains pass, counting the seconds between them. Listening. The pattern wasn't exact, but it was close enough. There were moments, short ones, when the platform would be empty, when the tunnel would be quiet, when no one would be looking. She rode back once more. This time she got off at the station just before the dark platform. Not the usual one she used. A different exit, a different staircase. She followed the signs slowly, reading them as she moved, mapping the space in her mind. The corridors were narrower here, older tile, less foot traffic. She passed a maintenance door, then another. One of them had a chain looped loosely through the handles, not locked, just placed there. She noticed that. Kept walking. At the end of the corridor, there was a service gate. Metal. Paint worn thin at the edges. A small sign attached to it. Faded, barely readable. Authorized personnel only. The latch didn't sit quite right. It wasn't fully closed. Marjorie stopped. She stood there for a moment, listening. Footsteps in the distance. A train pulling into a station somewhere behind her. Voices. But not here. Not in this corridor. She reached out slowly. Touched the latch. It shifted under her fingers with almost no resistance. She paused again. Not because she was afraid. Because she was making sure that she understood what she was doing, that she wasn't rushing, that she was choosing this. Then she lifted it. The gate opened with a soft, dull sound. The air changed immediately. Cooler still. Carrying a faint metallic scent. Old pipes, damp concrete, something that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. She stepped through, closed the gate behind her. The noise from the station faded almost completely. Ahead of her, a narrow passage stretched forward. Dim light from the station behind her reached only a few feet in. Beyond that, the space dissolved into shadow. Marjorie reached into her purse. Her fingers found the small flashlight she had carried for years. She hadn't used it in a long time. Not until now. She clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow line. Concrete walls, old wiring along the ceiling. Dust undisturbed. She moved slowly. Each step placed carefully. Listening. Counting. Not the distance. The rhythm. Her own movement. The passage curved slightly to the left, then straightened. And then she saw it. The backside of the platform. Not the side the train passed. The hidden side. The one behind the barrier. She moved closer. The gap she had seen from the train was here, wider than it had looked through the glass. Just enough. She turned her body slightly, stepped through. The platform stretched out in front of her, silent. Still. Larger than it had seemed from the train. The tile along the walls was older, a different pattern, muted colors beneath layers of dust. The lights overhead flickered faintly. Some still worked. Others had long since gone dark. Her footsteps sounded louder here. Echoing. Even though she wasn't walking heavily. Pip shifted inside the carrier. She set him down carefully, opened the door. He stepped out slowly, paused, then took a few cautious steps forward. His tail stayed low but steady. Marjorie watched him. Then she looked up, taking it in, the length of the platform, the benches, the signs, too faded to read. Everything left behind. Everything untouched. She moved forward slowly, counting again. 1 step, 2, 3. Her flashlight moved across the walls, across the floor, across the edges of things that hadn't been seen in years. Dust, old paper, a forgotten bottle near the far bench. Nothing recent, nothing living, except her. She reached the center of the platform, stopped, turned slowly in place, memorizing the exits, the angles, the distance between columns. Her breathing stayed steady, not rushed, not shallow, just present. Pip moved a little farther this time, sniffed along the base of the wall, then looked back at her. Waiting. Marjorie nodded slightly. More to herself than to him. She walked toward the far end. There, near the wall, she found it. A staircase. Not the one behind the barrier. A different one. Narrow. Concrete. Leading upward into darkness. She raised the flashlight. The beam didn't reach the top, just a few steps in. Enough to see that it hadn't been used in a long time. Dust thick along the edges. No footprints. Marjorie stood at the base of the stairs, thinking. Not about what was above. Not yet. Just about the space she was in. What it offered. What it didn't. The air was cool but not freezing. Still but not suffocating. Quiet. Completely quiet. For the first time in days, no voices, no footsteps, no trains overhead. Just stillness. She turned back slowly, looked across the platform again, at the empty space, at the distance, at the possibility. Something settled inside her, not relief. Not yet. But something close to control. Something she hadn't felt since before the hallway. Before the lock. Marjorie picked up Pip's carrier. He stepped inside without hesitation this time. She closed the door gently. Then she walked back toward the gap, counting her steps again. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to remember. 32. She stopped, turned once more, looked at the platform behind her, still, waiting. Then she stepped through the gap and into the passage. The air shifted again. Cooler here. Less movement. The kind of stillness that didn't belong to the outside world. Marjorie paused just inside, letting her eyes adjust. The flashlight beam stretched ahead, thin but steady. Behind her, the platform remained silent, waiting. She didn't go far that night. Just enough to understand the way back. Just enough to remember. Then she returned through the gap, retraced her steps, and slipped out the way she had come. Back into the corridor. Back into the noise. The motel room felt louder when she returned. The trains above, the pipes in the walls. Even Pip, shifting on the bed, seemed sharper now. She set the carrier down. Sat for a moment, then lay back without turning on the light. Her eyes stayed open. Not because she couldn't sleep, because her mind was elsewhere. Counting, measuring, replaying. The next evening, she went back. Earlier this time. The timing mattered now. She moved through the station with more certainty, less hesitation at the gate, less pause before the latch. The passage greeted her the same way. Cool. Still. Unchanged. She stepped through the gap again. This time she didn't stop at the center. She walked the length of the platform. Slowly, counting her steps. Listening to how the sound changed, depending on where she stood. Near the walls, it echoed differently. Closer, tighter. Near the center, it spread out. Thinner. She noticed that. Noted everything. At the far end, she set the carrier down, opened it. Pip stepped out again, more confident this time. He sniffed the floor, then the base of the wall, moving in small circles before settling into a slow exploration. Marjorie watched him for a moment. Then she turned her attention upward. The ceiling. Pipes ran along it, old, some wrapped in insulation that had worn thin over the years. She lifted her hand, waited. A drop of water fell. Light. Barely noticeable, but steady. She waited again. Another drop. Same spot. Same interval. She nodded slightly. She stayed longer that night. Long enough for the air to shift. For the faint vibration of a passing train to move through the walls above. Not loud, but present. She stood still when it happened. Feeling it. Counting how long it lasted. Noticing how it faded. The rhythm wasn't random. It followed something. Something she could learn. On the third night, she brought a small bag. Nothing large, just what she could carry without drawing attention. A folded blanket, a bottle of water, a small container of food. She moved carefully. The same path, the same steps, the same count. 32. She chose a spot near the middle of the platform, not too close to the entrance, not too far from the far end, a place where she could see both directions. She laid the blanket down, smoothed it with her hands, set the bag beside it. Then she stepped back, looked at it, not as something temporary, but as something placed. Intentional. Pip circled once before settling onto the blanket. He didn't hesitate this time, didn't look back toward the gap, just lowered himself and rested his head. Marjorie sat beside him. The platform stretched out around her, still empty, still silent, but no longer unfamiliar. She began to notice more. The way the air moved differently at different times of night. Sometimes a faint current passed through the space, carrying cooler air from one end to the other. Other times, it stayed completely still. She traced it. Moved her hand through the air, feeling for changes. Mapped it without drawing. The dripping pipe became something she returned to. Each night, she watched it. Counted. Timed the drops. Not exactly regular, but close enough. She positioned a small container beneath it. Waited. Listened. The first time it filled even slightly, she checked the water. Clear. No smell. She didn't drink it. Not yet. But she noted it. She began to move differently. Quieter. Slower. Not out of fear. Out of understanding. Her steps adjusted to the space. Her breathing matched the stillness. Even the way she set things down changed. Softer, more deliberate. Days above ground became shorter. Just enough time to move through the station. To observe. To gather what she needed. Then back down. Back to the platform. Back to the quiet. By the end of the week, the motel room felt like something she passed through. Not something she stayed in. She left earlier, returned later. Sometimes not at all. On the 7th night, she didn't go back. Not to the motel. She had considered it. Stood near the station entrance longer than usual, looking at the street, at the movement, at the lights in the windows above. Then she turned, went back down. The platform felt different that night. Not because it had changed. Because she had. She set her bag down in the same place, adjusted the blanket, checked the container beneath the pipe, half full. She noted that. Sat, listened. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It had layers. Small sounds she hadn't noticed before. The faint shift of air, the distant vibration of trains. Pip's breathing beside her, each one distinct, each one part of something. She lay down slowly. The concrete beneath the blanket was firm, unforgiving, but steady. She closed her eyes, not expecting sleep, just rest. When she opened them again, the light hadn't changed. There was no sun here, no clear way to measure time, only the rhythm she had learned, the vibrations, the air, the drops of water. She sat up, looked around. Everything was where she had left it. Nothing disturbed, nothing moved. Marjorie stood, walked the length of the platform again. Counting. Not because she needed to remember, because it anchored her. Gave shape to the space. 32 steps from the gap to the center. 68 to the far end. She repeated it. Once. Twice. Until it settled. When she returned to her spot, Pip lifted his head, watched her, then settled again. No concern, no confusion, just acceptance. Marjorie sat beside him, her hands resting lightly on her knees. Same position as the motel. Same position as before. But not the same feeling. Up there, she had been waiting. For something to change. For someone to notice. For something to begin. Down here, nothing was waiting. Nothing expected anything from her. The space didn't ask, didn't judge, didn't remove. She looked across the platform, at the length of it, at the quiet, at the place she had stepped into by choice. And for the first time since she left the hallway, her breathing settled. Not because things were better, but because they were hers. The platform didn't change. Not in the way places above ground did. No shifting light through windows. No voices rising and falling. No footsteps passing by to remind you that time was moving whether you noticed it or not. Down here, time moved differently. It gathered in small things. In the slow filling of the container beneath the pipe. In the fading edge of a footprint she had made days before. In the way Pip's routine settled into something steady. Sleep, walk, pause, watch. Marjorie adjusted to it. Not quickly, but completely. She began to organize her space. Not with much. There wasn't much to organize. But the way she placed things started to matter. The blanket stayed folded when she wasn't using it. The bag rested against the column at a slight angle, always in the same position. The container beneath the pipe shifted only when it needed to. Everything had a place. Everything stayed there. She moved through the platform differently now. Not exploring. Knowing. Her steps became quieter. Not forced, just naturally softer, as if the space itself asked for it. She learned where the floor dipped slightly near the far end, where the tiles were cracked just enough to catch the edge of a shoe, where the ceiling pipes ran closer together, casting thinner shadows when she passed beneath them. None of it surprised her anymore. Until it happened while she was clearing a small section near the side corridor, not far from the center. A space she had walked past dozens of times. She had begun moving debris out of the way. Nothing large, just small things left behind, broken pieces of wood, rusted fragments of metal, a section of old paneling that leaned against the wall as if it had been placed there and forgotten. She picked up one piece, set it aside, then another. As she shifted the paneling, her hand brushed against the wall behind it. And something felt off. Not visually, not immediately, but in the sound. Her knuckles had touched the surface lightly, and it hadn't sounded the same. She paused, looked at the wall. It appeared like the rest. Same dull color, same worn texture, same age, but when she tapped it again, lightly, the sound came back different. Hollow. Not entirely, but enough. Marjorie leaned in closer. She placed her palm flat against the surface. Pressed. Then tapped again, this time a little firmer. The sound shifted slightly depending on where she touched. Solid. Then hollow. Then solid again. A difference, subtle, but clear. She stepped back, looked at the section as a whole. There was a panel there, fitted into the wall. The edges were thin, almost invisible beneath layers of dust and paint. But now that she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The lines didn't quite match the rest of the structure. Too clean, too straight. Marjorie brushed the surface with her sleeve. Dust lifted into the beam of her flashlight, slowly settling, revealing more. The panel wasn't part of the original wall. It had been placed there. Later, she didn't touch it again right away. Instead, she stood still, thinking, not rushing forward, not forcing anything, just placing it. Within everything else she had learned, a memory surfaced. Quietly. Not something she had been trying to recall, just something that had been waiting. Her husband's voice years ago, at the kitchen table, talking about work. Not to explain, just talking. Service corridors, he had said once, almost casually. Places nobody maps properly. They get sealed off, then reopened, then sealed again. She hadn't asked much about it then. It hadn't mattered. Until now. Marjorie looked at the panel again. The edges. The way it sat within the wall. Not decorative, not accidental. Deliberate. She reached out, pressed her fingers along one side. Nothing moved. She tried the other. Still nothing. The surface was fixed, secured. She lowered her hand. Not frustrated. Not disappointed. Just aware. This wasn't something she would open in one moment. It would take time. That night, she didn't try again. She returned to her place, sat, listened. but her attention had shifted. Not to the platform as a whole. To that one section. The next day, above ground, she moved differently. More observant. She stopped near maintenance areas in the station, watched workers pass. Not closely enough to draw attention, but enough. She noticed the tools they carried, the way they moved, the sounds their equipment made. Back underground, she returned to the panel. This time she brought something small, a piece of metal she had found earlier. Flat. Thin. Not much, but enough to test. She slid it gently along the edge, feeling for space, for give, for anything that might shift. It caught slightly near the bottom, a small resistance. She paused, adjusted the angle, tried again. The metal slipped in just a fraction, not enough to open anything, but enough to confirm. There was space behind it. She withdrew the piece slowly, sat back on her heels, looked at the panel. This wasn't just part of the wall. It was covering something. Over the next few days, she didn't force it. She returned again and again, testing different edges, different angles, learning where the resistance changed, where it held firm, where it gave slightly. Each time she stopped before pushing too far. Not out of caution, out of control. She wasn't trying to break it. She was trying to understand it. The space around her remained the same. The platform. The silence. Pip's quiet movements. But beneath all of it, something had shifted. There was something here. Something placed. Something hidden. And for the first time since she stepped underground, Marjorie wasn't just adapting. She was searching. The panel no longer blended into the wall. Even when she wasn't standing in front of it, she could see it in her mind. The edges, the faint difference in color, the hollow sound beneath her knuckles. It had become a fixed point, something unfinished. She returned to it every day. Not immediately. She followed her routine first, checked the water beneath the pipe, walked the platform, counted her steps. Let Pip make his slow circle along the walls. Only then did she move to the panel. Her approach didn't change. She didn't rush, didn't force. She worked the edges carefully, sliding the thin piece of metal into the narrow gaps she had found. Testing, feeling, listening. On the third day, something shifted. Not much, just a slight give along the lower corner, barely noticeable. But it hadn't been there before. Marjorie stopped immediately. She didn't push further. She sat back on her heels looking at the panel, letting the moment settle. The next time she came prepared. Not with tools. With patience. She worked along the same edge again. Same pressure. Same angle. The metal slipped in a little deeper this time. A fraction of an inch more. She felt it. A hollow space behind the surface. Larger than she had expected. She withdrew the metal slowly, placed her hand flat against the panel, pressed gently. Nothing moved, but she could feel it now. The separation. That evening, she didn't return to her resting place right away. She stayed near the panel, studying it. Not just the edges, but the surface. There were marks there. Faint, almost erased by time. Lines that didn't belong to wear or damage. Intentional. She brushed the dust aside again. Slower this time, more carefully. The marks became clearer. Not writing, not symbols, just scratches. Parallel, like something had been moved against it. More than once. Marjorie stepped back, looked around the platform, at the columns, the benches, the forgotten pieces scattered along the edges. Then she saw it, near the far wall, half hidden behind a rusted maintenance cart. A length of metal. longer than the piece she had been using, flat at one end, bent slightly at the other. She walked over, picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, cold in her hands, worn smooth in places. She returned to the panel, positioned the flat end along the edge she had been working, adjusted her grip, paused. Then she applied pressure. Slowly, carefully, the metal edge slipped into the gap, deeper than before. She felt resistance. Then, a small shift. A sound. Soft. Dull, but unmistakable. Marjorie froze. Listened. Nothing else moved. No echo beyond the space. No reaction from the structure around her. She pressed again. A little more. The panel shifted outward, just slightly. Enough to break the seal it had held for years. Dust fell in a thin line along the edge. The air changed again. Faint. But there. She stepped back. Lowered the metal bar. Looked at what she had done. The panel wasn't open, not yet. But it wasn't closed anymore. She didn't rush forward. She waited. Let the space settle. Let herself settle. Then she reached out, placed her fingers along the edge, pulled. The panel moved slowly, reluctantly, as if it had forgotten how. Behind it, darkness. Marjorie stepped back instinctively, not out of fear, out of respect. For what hadn't been seen in a long time. She lifted the flashlight, angled it into the opening. The beam cut through dust and still air, revealing a narrow passage, concrete walls, tighter than the one she had entered through. Older. She widened the opening enough to pass through, set the metal bar aside, picked up the carrier. Pip shifted inside but didn't make a sound. Marjorie stepped through. The air inside was heavier still, undisturbed. Her footsteps echoed differently here, closer, contained. The passage led straight for a few feet, then turned. She followed it slowly, counting again. 1, 2, 3. At the end, she stopped. A door stood in front of her. Steel. Set into the concrete. Edges sealed tightly into the frame. No handle. Just a lock. Old. Worn. But intact. Marjorie lowered the flashlight slightly. Looked around. The space was small. Bare. Except for one thing. Near the base of the wall. Behind a pipe. Something glinted faintly in the beam. She stepped closer. Reached down, moved the pipe slightly. A ring of keys. Small. Metal. Each one different. Each one worn in its own way. Marjorie lifted them carefully. They made a soft sound as they shifted together. Not loud, but enough to echo in the narrow space. She held them in her palm, looked at them, then at the door. There was no sign, no marking, nothing to explain why they were there. But they fit. They belonged. Marjorie stepped closer to the door, raised the flashlight, examined the lock. Old design. Simple. Mechanical. She chose one key. Not randomly. The one with the most wear. The edges smoother than the others. She inserted it into the lock. It didn't turn. She removed it. Tried another. Same result. She didn't rush. She moved through them one by one. Each key tested, each attempt deliberate. Time passed. She didn't measure it. Then, a click. Small, precise. Marjorie stopped. Her hand remained on the key. She didn't turn it further right away. She listened. Nothing. Then she turned it. Slowly. The mechanism moved, resisting at first, then giving way. The lock released. She stood there for a moment, hand still on the key. Then she pulled the door open. The hinges moved more smoothly than expected. Quiet, controlled. Inside, a room. Not large, but complete. A desk. Metal. Covered in dust. Filing cabinets along one wall. Closed. Untouched. Shelves, holding stacks of paper. Maps. Folders. All preserved in the stillness. Marjorie stepped inside. The beam of her flashlight moved across the space, revealing more. Nothing had been disturbed. Not in years. She turned slowly. Taking it in. This wasn't just a hidden space. It had been used, organized, maintained, and then left. Marjorie walked toward the nearest cabinet, reached out, rested her hand on the handle. The dust shifted slightly beneath her fingers. She paused. Not from hesitation, from understanding. Whatever this was, it hadn't been meant to be found. And now it was. Marjorie didn't move right away. The room held its own kind of silence, not like the platform. This was tighter, sealed, as if the air itself had been waiting. Her flashlight moved slowly across the desk. A thin layer of dust covered everything. Undisturbed. No fingerprints. No signs of anything recent. She stepped forward. One foot, then the other, careful not to disturb more than necessary. The desk drawer resisted at first. She pulled gently, then a little firmer. It opened with a soft scrape. Inside, papers, stacked neatly, not scattered, not forgotten in disorder. Organized. Marjorie lifted the top sheet. The paper had yellowed at the edges, the ink still dark. Typed. Columns, numbers, addresses. She didn't read it all at once. Her eyes moved slowly, line by line, not rushing, letting the shape of it form before the meaning. She set it down. Opened the next drawer, more of the same. Folders this time. Labeled, dates, street names. Sections of the city she recognized. Marjorie turned slightly, looked toward the cabinets along the wall. She walked to the first one, placed her hand on the handle. Pulled. It opened more easily than she expected. Inside, rows of files, each one standing upright, each one marked. She pulled one out, carried it to the desk, opened it under the beam of her flashlight. Maps. Detailed. Not like the ones you find in stations. These showed layers. Lines beneath lines. Old routes. Closed corridors. Infrastructure that no longer appeared on public diagrams. She leaned closer, tracing one section with her finger. A familiar line. The one she had been writing. Then something beneath it. Fainter. A second layer. Running alongside. Connected in places. Separated in others. Her finger paused. Followed the line upward. Above ground. Street names appeared. Clearer here. Not faded. Marjorie straightened slightly. She knew those streets. She turned the page. Another map. More layers. More connections. This one included markings. Circles. Boxes. certain locations emphasized. She moved the light closer. Read the names. Slowly. Then she stopped. There. The street. Her street. She leaned in closer. The name was clear. Unmistakable. The building number sat beside it. Not hers exactly, but the one next door. And another across the street. Connected. Linked to something below. Marjorie's hand remained still on the paper. She didn't pull back. Didn't react outwardly. But something shifted inside her. She turned the page again. More documents. These weren't maps. Records. Typed pages. Columns of ownership. Dates. Transfers. Notes written in the margins. She read carefully. Comparing. Cross-referencing without even realizing she was doing it. Names repeated. Companies, departments, agreements. She found a pattern. Certain buildings appeared more than once, grouped together. Her building, among them. She moved to another file, opened it. Older records. Handwritten notes this time. Messier. But still structured. A date stood out. Decades ago. Another. Then another. The same locations. The same cluster. Marjorie stepped back from the desk. Just a little. Letting the pieces settle. This wasn't random. This room. These files. They had been used, maintained, updated, then stopped. She turned slowly, looking around the space again. The cabinets, the desk, the shelves. This wasn't storage. It was a system, and it connected to the world above. Marjorie walked back to the desk, picked up the first map again, held it at a slight angle to the light. Her building sat within a shaded area. Not highlighted, not marked differently, but within a boundary. She followed that boundary outward. It extended beyond just her street. Across several blocks, infrastructure rights. That was the phrase she found in one of the documents. She read it again, slower, unresolved. Another word. She didn't fully understand the legal meaning. Not yet, but she understood enough. This wasn't clean. The ownership above. The buildings. The land. It had layers. Just like the map. And those layers hadn't all been settled. Marjorie closed the file, placed it back carefully. She didn't take anything. Not yet. She moved to another cabinet, opened it. More records. More names. More connections. She didn't read everything. She didn't need to. The pattern was already forming. She stepped back again. The room felt smaller now, not physically, but in what it contained. Information. Quiet. Buried. She turned off the flashlight for a moment. Darkness filled the space completely. No light from above. No flicker from the platform. Just stillness. Then she turned it back on. The room returned. The files, the desk, the maps. Marjorie stood there, thinking. Not about what to do next, not yet. About what this meant. She hadn't been pushed out of something stable. She had been removed from something uncertain. Something built on layers she had never seen. She walked back toward the door. Paused at the threshold. Looked back once more. Everything remained where it had been. But it wasn't the same. Because now, she knew it was there. She stepped out into the narrow passage. closed the door behind her, turned the key. The lock clicked back into place. She stood there for a moment, listening. Then she moved back through the passage, toward the panel, toward the platform. Each step measured, each turn remembered. When she stepped back onto the open platform, the air felt wider again. Less contained, more open. Pip shifted inside the carrier. Quiet. Watching. Marjorie walked to her place. Set the carrier down. Sat. The platform stretched out in front of her. Same as before, but not the same. Because above it, something existed. And below it, she had found something that didn't belong to anyone anymore. Or maybe it never had. Marjorie sat there a long time, her hands resting lightly in her lap, the quiet stretching around her like something alive. Pip shifted beside her, then settled again, as if he had already decided this place was safe. She looked out across the platform. The same cracked tiles, the same dim lights. Nothing had changed. Except it had. Up above, there had always been doors, keys, names on leases, people who decided who stayed and who didn't. Down here, none of that followed her. She thought about the hallway, the smell, the sound of the lock turning. She had stood there waiting for something, an explanation, maybe, a reason that made sense. But the truth was quieter than that. They hadn't pushed her out. They had simply moved on without her. And somehow, in all that empty space they left behind, she had found something they couldn't take. Not the room, not the platform, not even the hidden records, something else. The part of her that still noticed things. Still counted steps, still paid attention when something didn't feel right. She let out a slow breath. Above her, another train passed. The vibration moved through the walls, then faded. Pip lifted his head, listening, then relaxed again. Marjorie looked down at him, then back at the platform. And for the first time, she didn't wonder how long she could stay. She wondered, how many people walk out of their own lives and never realize there was another way in?